Hello, my name is Lou Garrison. I'm a professor in the departments of Pharmacy, Global Health, and Health Services at the University of Washington. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you as a part of the course organized by Professor Joseph Babagamira. Joseph is a colleague of mine at the university and was a former student of mine, actually. So it's a real pleasure to be a part of a course that he's organized. Professor Babagamira and I have done workshops together over the years and worked on courses. So I'm real pleased to be a part of this presentation and discussion. Just in terms of my background, I worked for 13 years in nonprofit policy research after finishing my PhD in economics and specializing in health economics. Worked at Project Hope, where I got into doing international work at the time in Jamaica and Poland on health services issues. Then I went to work for 12 years in the pharmaceutical industry. I worked for Roche Pharmaceuticals, where I was the head of health economics and pricing in Switzerland at the end of that. And then 11 years ago, I came to the University of Washington, where I've been a professor. And we have a PhD program and master's programs and students from around the world, including Professor Babagamira. So a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you. In week 9, we cover 3 topics. The first part is an introduction to health technology assessment, HTA, including a discussion of the principles, some historical background, and the objectives. In part 2, we discuss the HTA in low and middle income countries and some work that we've done around trying to understand the evolution of HTA in these settings. And then in part 3, I'll discuss some of the economics of drug development, how that relates to incentives for innovation, and some definitions of value in healthcare. Before defining health technology, it's useful to think more broadly about what is technology, and I think we would all agree with this definition that technology is the application of scientific or other organized knowledge, including any tool, technique, product, process, method, organization, or system to practical tasks. So technology is not just a tool or technique. It extends to the broader level of an organization or system issues, but again with an emphasis on sort of operationally doing things practically. Now, when we turn to healthcare technology, most people probably think of drugs and devices, but it's actually much a longer list. So it's got medicines. We think of diagnostic tests, including indicators and reagents, devices, CT scanners, down to everyday devices like crutches, and maybe equipment and supplies would fall into to that. Surgical procedures, medical procedures are a kind of technology. The support systems, including nursing and pharmacy that support care delivery, organizational questions around the decentralized versus centralized, how managerial systems, and then all of these, when we're talking about healthcare, they're used in a variety of ways, and many times they're used. Each of these types of technologies are used for things like prevention, screening, diagnosis, treatment, and rehabilitation. So we're thinking of technology and healthcare technology quite broadly in this context. Of course, with this broad definition of technology, one can think of technology assessment quite broadly. It's not necessarily just about healthcare technology. We can also assess automobile technology. We can assess environmental technology and so on. In fact, in the U.S. in the 1980s, there was an Office of Technology Assessment that looked at healthcare applications, but also looked broadly at all kinds of technology. But for our purposes here, we're going to focus on healthcare technology. And as I'm sure you would understand this, the field has developed, and it's become a field, to aid policymakers in making decisions about healthcare technology, adoption and diffusion. So the goal is to provide information to policymakers and other decision makers to inform their decisions about adoption and diffusion of healthcare technology. So when we say policymakers, we actually mean a wide range of decision makers, from high-level government decision makers deciding about types of insurance to offer and the structure of the delivery system, to clinical policy makers who are deciding what treatment guidelines to specify for particular technologies or medicines. So they're thinking about adopting that into the healthcare system, but also controlling its use and diffusion throughout the system. As you can imagine, and based on everything that's been discussed at this point in terms of systematically looking at evidence and making decisions, the hope is that by making these decisions more rational, the decision making will be more efficient and even more fair, and will be less subjective, so that we can measure things and make the system kind of meet our objectives more broadly. Now we know that the reality is that the decisions at most of these levels are subject to bias and emotion and so on, and are not necessarily based only on evidence or on evidence. And certainly individual experience can bias decisions, emotions can bias decisions, and so on. And you're probably aware that there's a field of behavioral economics that looks into sort of systematic biases that we make. We're not very good about thinking about probabilities, and we make systematic mistakes. And so to guard against that, it's important to have a more systematic process that will aid in decision making. Health technology assessment has been defined in many ways, though I think there's a common core to the definitions that's captured in this first bullet. And we use this definition that it's a structured analysis of healthcare technologies performed for the purpose of providing input into regulatory, coverage/formulary, and reimbursement policy decisions. So breaking that definition down, the structured analysis means going through a systematic review of the evidence, specifying the objectives of the analysis, the scope of the analysis, and going through step by step to look at the outcomes, both clinical and economic. Now, when we say regulatory, we're talking about decisions made by national regulatory agencies such as the FDA and the EMA in Europe. And so they're basically making a benefit-risk determination. Would the benefits of allowing a technology on the market outweigh the risks? Recognizing that at that point there's usually very limited evidence. In the case of medicines, 1 or 2 randomized trials. Now, the coverage or formulary decision is the decision made by insurance bodies, either public or private. Coverage means, are they going to include it in the benefits package that's available to members of the health plan or the national health system? Formulary speaks specifically to medicines. Will it be included on the available medicines list, a positive list, or what you might call an essential medicines list, and in some cases, but it's really just I guess you could argue that the formulary could include essential medicines and less essential medicines, but certainly that's the same idea of a list of what's available. And then systems face the question of, if something's available, how much are they going to reimburse, or how much of reimburse for it, what percentage of it's going to be covered. If it's percentage, then we talk about co-insurance. So is the patient paying 10%, then that would be a co-insurance. If they were paying $3, that would be a co-payment. So decisions are made about reimbursement policy. Now, in the U.S. we have a tiering system for medicine, so that a tier 1 medicine would have greater coverage or might be provided without any co-payment or co-insurance, whereas a tier 4 might have a substantial co-insurance. Not all systems work that way. We have also emphasized the process aspects of technology, and it is important to recognize that HTA is itself a health technology. It's a process for making certain types of resource allocation decisions, and countries vary in the sophistication and development of this. While most countries have this national regulatory agency, the majority of countries do not yet have a health technology agency specifically, and the decisions are made more or less ad hoc and with other institutions. So as health systems evolve, and we'll talk about this in the next section, it's important to sort of see how health technology assessment can evolve in that context. in thinking about health technology assessment specifically, we have found it useful to think about two different levels, what we call the micro level and the macro level. The micro level focuses on drugs and devices that are considered incremental to the healthcare system. So you can imagine the existing healthcare system and then saying, should I add this new medicine to the national formulary to make it available to patients? That's a micro level HTA, and for which we would like to see a sort of a cost effectiveness analysis, including an incremental cost effectiveness ratio. So that's what we mean by micro level. Macro level is, the broader level at the health system level. Now, within the micro level, we can also identify what we call clinical practice guidelines, which is really the way in which individual technologies are combined within the delivery system to manage patients. So you may be aware that the term standard practice guidelines is widely used, and the WHO has worked to develop standard treatment guidelines in certain areas, and many countries develop standard treatment guidelines to assist physicians. Obviously, to figure out where the technology fits into that, we're really talking about what would be an efficient use of that technology within the flow of existing clinical pathways. So we consider that a micro level HTA question. Now, when we turn to macro level HTA, we're talking about the broader architecture or framework of the health system in general, including issues such as the types of facilities, hospitals, clinics, and so on, the health workforce, nurses, doctors, pharmacists, and so on, and then also healthcare financing structures. Is it, is there a public insurance market? Is a private insurance market allowed? Do we have managed care organizations, and so on? So those are macro level decisions. There's also an important term you should hear called priority setting that's used as related to health technology assessment, and it's operating at a higher level, looking at things like the burden of disease in a country and the workforce constraints, and then trying to figure out, are we going to devote our resources to dealing with obesity or hypertension or cardiac disease and so on. So setting those priorities can then influence the information that we get from micro level HTA. So it's important to recognize that there are both of those. Now, macro level HTA is what might traditionally be called health services research. And most of the time we'll be talking about micro level HTA here, but it's important to keep in mind that these are related, and obviously the design of the health system is going to affect how micro level decisions affect the system or the adoption of technologies that are considered in micro level HTA. You've probably thought about the issue of why the use of technology assessment varies by country and by different types of technology. Certainly it's not just focused on healthcare. There was an agency started in the United States in the 1980s called the Office of Technology Assessment that considered not just healthcare technologies but environmental, automotive, you name it. It was really to look quite broadly. Now, just an interesting sidelight, that agency got into political trouble for making some difficult decisions and then was eventually eliminated. So that's, and we'll come back to this point on the importance of the need for some independence in technology assessment. But basically, we're all aware that countries vary substantially in the resources they have to devote to healthcare, ranging from 5% of gross domestic product in some countries to 18% or so of GDP in the United States. And as countries' incomes rise and they devote more resources to healthcare, they have a better, more of an incentive to really manage those resources efficiently and more wherewithal to do that. But they're also more subject to the influence of technological change, which occurs both for economic reasons and just for scientific reasons. And that's new technologies are coming on board, and we need to make decisions about what to include. Healthcare policymakers were less content just to leave the decision to the regulatory agency in terms of benefit risk, and then look at the overall cost. And as Professor Baba-Gamira has emphasized, we've had to make more and more decisions about value for money. So the benefit in relation to the cost. So that sort of spurred the interest in doing health technology assessment. It's important to recognize that not all technological change is good, or perceived technological change, and I want to talk about a few examples where it did not work, or was overused, or unsafe, and then we had to make adjustments. So technology assessment is also useful for identifying those situations. A good example of a technology that later was proved to be to have harm rather than benefit was gastric freezing for peptic ulcers, which was developed by a surgeon in the 1960s. And in 1963, some 15,000 procedures were performed, but it was observed that there were many deaths. By 1964, a randomized controlled trial showed that there was no benefit and the potential for harm. So the technology was abandoned, and as I'm sure you're aware, we have still dealing with peptic ulcers and gastrointestinal reflux disease and so on. So still a lot of technological change since the 60s, and we're still dealing with the problem. We haven't come up with a cure, but this was an example of a technology that was widely used, probably, in fact, probably prematurely. Would have been better to the randomized trial before 15,000 procedures were performed. But the assessment showed that it was not of health, did not have a good benefit harm balance, regardless of without even considering the cost. Now, another example of a technology that at least required some modification in use was CT scanning. In the 70s, it was a new technology. It was very exciting for radiologists to use this. It was most likely overused. They wanted to see the images. Their patients were curious, and so on. After later review, it was determined that much of this use was inappropriate in being used in situations where there was very little benefit. Now, just a sidebar on the term inappropriate. There is an economic interpretation of this, which would be that be a situation where the marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost. The underlying principle of the incremental cost effectiveness ratio. So, I always think it's useful to recognize that if we eliminate inappropriate procedure, we would save on that marginal cost, but we would also lose the marginal benefit. So there could still be that it's not efficient. The marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost, but there is some benefit. So I think it's important to recognize that some benefit would be lost, as well as along with the cost savings from eliminating inappropriate technologies. Very interesting example and highly cited is lung volume reduction surgery in the 1990s. It was developed by a surgeon to treat end-stage lung disease. In the late 90s, some 3,000 procedures were performed and reimbursed. And at that point, there had not been a randomized trial or even probably good observational data. So in 2003, the U.S. Medicare system supported a large randomized controlled trial. They found no benefit in the randomized trial, with exception for a small subgroup of patients, but in general there was a lot of harm for a lot of patients. Furthermore, cost-effectiveness analyses performed by one of our colleagues here at the University of Washington, Dr. Scott Ramsey, and colleagues, showed that it was not cost-effective. So this was an example that the use of the procedure fell off dramatically after that information. So it was an example of a kind of a positive example of where doing what we call comparative effectiveness research led to a change in practice. And in fact, this was actually fell under the concept of coverage with evidence development. So the procedure was covered for the patients participating in the trial, so it was paid for. But then the U.S. Medicare system, after getting the trial evidence, decided not to cover it and would no longer be covered after that point. But it was an example that's cited of coverage with evidence development. In a very thoughtful piece by two of the really founders of the field of health technology assessment, David Banta and Brian Luce, they basically point out that the need for this arose because we realized that relying strictly on health professionals to make sure that the benefits and risks were considered, that societal precious resource medical resources were being used efficiently was really insufficient to rely on them alone as a strategy for ensuring appropriate use. Again, many studies in many countries show tremendous variations across geographic regions and across subgroups of the population. So technologies aren't necessarily being applied fairly and efficiently if we rely solely on judgments of health professionals. Furthermore, health professionals are very busy. They've highly trained, but they live in an environment where technological change is extremely rapid. Not just in medicine, computers, biotechnology, nanotechnology are all affecting medicine. So keeping up with that is a challenge. And they basically argued that, look, our capacity to innovate and develop these technologies is running faster than our ability to assess them and to make rational decisions about their use. So we're making suboptimal decisions. This leads to inefficiencies, things that have marginal or no effectiveness, and often harm to patients. So this was their argument for why we need technology assessment. And again, they were critical in the development of the field of technology assessment. They were founders and really visionaries. This next slide is based on a paper that I thought was really insightful and path-breaking by three leading health policy analysts, Ezekiel Emanuel, Victor Fuchs, and Alan Garber. And they laid this out here back in 2007, and talking about the U.S. in particular, that there was a need for a national level technology outcomes assessment process to help guide decisions about healthcare resource allocation. Now, in the next couple of slides after this, we'll talk about some principles that would go into developing a health technology agency or a process. But I thought that these were some higher level principles that I thought this article brings out better. They talk about the importance of administrative independence, to try to minimize the influence of politics and on a health technology agency. To be independent, you need some core of dedicated funding so that the politicians can not just cut off funding on a whim because they don't like a particular decision. It's important that the resources are sufficient to do objective and timely research, use reliable methods, and that the results are disseminated systematically throughout the literature and to healthcare decision makers. And then it's important to have a governance and organizational structure that lend it legitimacy to a health technology agency. So again, I'll talk about some other aspects of the process in the next couple of slides, but I think it's important to keep in mind that getting these aspects right will have a lot to do with the survivability and credibility of a health technology assessment agency. The next three slides present an article headed up by Mike Drummond, but you can see a distinguished list of co-investigators from the field of pharmacoeconomics looking at and defining key principles for the improved conduct of HTA for resource allocation decisions. So I want to run through these principles with you. This is really a seminal article that has been very influential. The first principle of the 15 is that the goal and scope of the HTA should be explicit and relevant to its use. So this could speak, you need to define exactly what, in the case of an individual technology, what indications are considered, what patient subsets are considered, and so on. That needs to be explicit and relevant to the use of the technology. Ideally, HTA should be unbiased and transparent in terms of the process and the presentation of the results. It should consider all relevant technologies that are comparators to the technology under consideration, but primarily the current standard of care should be the base of the comparison. There are many technologies to consider, as we've discussed, and there needs to be a clear system for horizon scanning and setting priorities for which technologies to evaluate. You're probably aware that there are relatively few new medicines each year, usually less than 30, that are considered innovative and being considered by the Food and Drug Administration, whereas we have thousands of modifications in the device area. So setting priorities is a challenge. There They should consider appropriate methods, and there's certainly some debate about this, though practitioners of health economics advocate the use of the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, but or at least as part of a broader evaluation. But there are other kinds of methods that are used. Should consider all the evidence, a wide range of evidence and outcomes, not just focus on short-term clinical outcomes or focus on the trial data. Should ideally look at observational data. A societal perspective should be considered, and by that people mean various things, but certainly the first thing that comes to mind is we're not just looking at medical care resource use. People's time is involved in using the healthcare system. If they die, then their output is lost to the society more broadly. So certainly you can take a broader societal perspective. These assessments are always based on incomplete evidence, some more systematic than others. So it's important to characterize the uncertainty, the distribution around the parameters in the models. So these are the first 8 of the 15 principles. I think they're relatively obvious when you see them, but it's good to have them laid out systematically. The last 7 principles on the list of 15, number 9, HTA should consider and address issues of generalizability and transferability. So what that's basically saying is countries can learn from one another, and especially when it comes to clinical data can cross borders. We expect humans to be biologically similar across countries. Their healthcare systems and costs and reimbursement systems can be very different. But still, some information, if systems are similar, can be looked at across borders. So that's what generalizability and transferability is about. Now, the next one is very important, and I think if we look at successful HTA agencies, number 10 here, it's important that they have a deliberative process that engages all key stakeholder groups. And this is really, I think, something that people have come to appreciate, over the last 15 years as these processes have rolled out around the world. Those people doing number 11, the people doing the assessments must look for all the data, not just data from a trial, but all the relevant data. Implementation is obviously important, and it needs to be monitored. If an HTA agency is doing a good job, they need to be able to monitor things. HTA needs to be timely. Obviously, if something is efficient and beneficial to patients, and access is delayed, then some people are going to be worse off because they didn't have access in a timely fashion. As part of the implementation, it's important that the decisions and the findings be communicated to the various stakeholders and decision makers. So that would be part of a good process. And just the whole process itself should be transparent at a high level and clearly defined so that people see how the information is being used to make decisions. So these were 15 principles that the leaders of our field laid out for what would make for a good HTA process. And I think to these, to sort of set up if you couple this with the information from the Emmanuel et al. Article, you'll get the idea that to support these things there needs to be some administrative independence. I would like to end this session with just a final word about some broader considerations. First, I think it's important to recognize that the information generated by HTA processes in various countries is a global public good. By that we mean a public good is a good that we can all consume without using it up. Other people can use it, and obviously it can be used globally. And the important point is countries can benefit from looking at what other systems are doing in terms of making decisions. For example, it's well known that the Taiwanese HTA process looks at the HTAs from NICE in the UK, from CADITH in Canada, and from PBAC in Australia. So, you can benefit from looking across borders. Of course, as was mentioned just previously, there's sometimes limited generalizability and transferability, but nonetheless, we're seeing, especially on the clinical side, the clinical outcomes that other systems are projecting. Again, and also, more broadly at the macro level, if we think of HTA as a process, then different countries can also learn from each other's experiences about the processes and the best ways to engage stakeholder input and so on. So in implementing and evolving HTA in different countries, it's important to look at process lessons from other countries. So Thanks very much for your attention. Look forward to the next to part 2.